Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and while you're at it, click the bell to be notified of future videos. Here we are, the last two blocks. At the end of this video, I'll talk some more about putting your sashing and cornerstones on. And next week, we'll wrap it up and talk about borders and finishing the quilt. So for this week, we have block 11, which is called Rolling Stone. Here's the diagram. We have 4 square on-point units in the corners, and then we just have a rail fence unit in the sides and a plain block in the center. This is a 3x3 grid, so our 12-inch block, each unit in the grid finishes at 4 inches. Here are the patches, and these include the dies for AccuQuilt. We have 4 patches. And here are the cutting instructions for the individual fabrics. First thing we're going to do is make the square on point. Here are the fabrics and the patches. This is patch A and this is patch B, and these are for the square on point units, the 4 square on point units. These are the rectangles for the rail fence unit on the side, and this is the plain block in the center. So we'll start with our square on point units. Last time we tried something different. We cut the square for the square on point slightly smaller, and then we cut the triangles a little bit larger. That way, that will help us get the size that we need better. So we'll take this. We cut these at 3 1/4 inches instead of 3 3/8 inches. So we'll take our A patches and start with opposite sides and use a true 1/4 inch seam and sew these on opposite sides. Place the triangle right side up and then center the square in the middle and stitch your 1/4 inch, and then do the other side too. Do that for all 4 of your square on points. Once you've stitched the opposite sides and you've pressed either open or to one side, take your ruler and lay it along the square and cut off these nubs. Do it on both sides. Now you'll take the other 2 sides, put your fabric, your triangle right side up, and center this. Stitch a true 1/4 inch on this side and do it again on the bottom side of all 4 pieces. Now once you have finished the other sides and pressed, we're going to trim this down to 4 1/2 inches. These points are going to float. So what you'll need to do is just kind of position your ruler and check all of the sides of the fabric to make sure you can cut off some of the fabric. So up here is fine and to the right is fine. Now look over here, this is the 4 1/2 inch mark. So I'll need to move it over because it's not enough to cut off. And the same thing down here, look for the 4 1/2 inch mark, and I have enough to cut off there. Basically what I'm doing is just trying to center the ruler over the design. Make sure I have more than 4 1/2 inches of fabric on these sides and these sides. So now I'm just going to cut it. And then flip this. And now these 2 sides, put your 4 1/2 inch mark on your ruler on these 2 sides and then trim. And now do that to all 4 of your square on point units. Now we'll take our rectangles and sew them together like this. Sew them together and press the seams. And these are the side units. Then we'll put our units together. Sew the top units into a row, the middle and the bottom. Press your seams, then sew the rows together. Now let's move on to our final block, and this one is called Charms. The square on point is actually a square in a square in a square. It's pieced the same way. You start with a square and you add triangles around all 4 corners, and you could actually keep adding triangles as long as you wanted to make a big quilt. We have 4 patches, and they're listed here. These are the cutting diagrams for the 4 patches. And included here are the AccuQuilt dies that you need to cut these patches. Here are the cutting instructions for the fabric. We will be making half square triangles 2 at a time, and then piecing the square and a square and a square. And then we'll put the block together. Here are the fabrics and the patches. These are patch A for the half square triangles, and we've cut these slightly larger to trim them down, and we're going to make 2 at a time half square triangles. These are rectangles that go on the outside edges of the block. These are for the square and a square and a square. So you'll put one round of this light color fabric, then another round of the dark color fabric. So let's start first with the half square triangles, 2 at a time. We'll take 2 squares, put them together, right sides together, and on the light square we're going to draw a diagonal line. On each side of this diagonal line we're going to sew a 1/4 inch. So we'll have 2 lines of stitching, one on the right side and one on the left side of this line. And do that for all 6 of your squares. When you've finished stitching on both sides, we're going to cut it in half on the line. Then we'll have 2 half square triangles. Press those seams either open or to one side, and then we're going to trim it down to 2.5 inches. So I have my 6.5 inch ruler. I'm lining up the diagonal line with the seam line, and then I'm checking all 4 sides to make sure I have enough to trim off. So I have enough here, and here's my 2.5, and there's some to cut off there and a little to cut off there. Then we just trim these 2 edges first. Flip this around and trim the other 2 edges. Now we can just line up the 2.5 on the bottom and the side and the diagonal line. And you do that for all 12 of your half square triangles. For step 2, we're going to take our rectangles and our half square triangles we just made, and we're going to piece the 2 units that go around the edge. So the first one is the short one. We piece that together like this. So just sew those together and press the seams. The second one is the long one, and we piece those like this. Piece together and press the seams open. You'll make 2 like this and 2 like this. And then here's what they look like. Now we're going to start the square in a square in a square, or we can call it the square on point in a square. This is the E patch and this is the D patch. And I cut these the exact size that it calls for in the cutting instructions. I did a test block and I found out it worked better using the exact sizes, and we're going to sew a scant 1/4 inch. For this one, the C patch, I cut it slightly larger. It should have been cut 4 7/8 and I cut it 5 inches, so slightly larger here. But the difference is we're going to sew a scant 1/4 inch instead of a true 1/4 inch. So we take this first round and we'll center the square on the triangle like this and sew your scant 1/4 inch, and then do the same thing on this side. I also got better results on this if I press the seams toward the triangles. Now we're going to cut these nubs off and sew the opposite sides the same way, or center the square on the triangle and then do the other side too. When you sew this second round, you see the little angle here that the triangle or the 2 triangles make, and even sewing a scant 1/4 inch, your seam line will come out right at that point. It will come out right at the point over here and on this side. And what that gives you is when you press your seams either open or to the side, it makes this edge here straight across. So I press to the triangles again, and you see the edges are fairly straight, and we'll just cut off the nubs and then add the next round. Now we take the blue fabric and we do it the same way. Center the square on the blue fabric. The blue fabric we cut slightly larger, like 1/8 of an inch larger, so you won't have your angles meeting here, and then sew a scant 1/4 inch. Be careful of your point. When you stitch your point, you want to stitch away from the point so you won't cut the point off. Cut off the nubs. And then add your final 2 triangles. Now we're going to trim this down to 8.5 inches. So you just center it on, and there's not going to be much to cut off. But you want to make sure that you have a 1/4 inch on each point. Then flip this around, and now line up your 8.5 on the side and the bottom. Check your 1/4 inch on your points and trim. There's not very much to trim at all. The next thing we'll do is put the short pieces you sewed earlier. We're going to put the short ones on the sides. Piece these and press the seams, and then piece these at the top and bottom. Okay, now stay tuned for a few little tips about adding sashing. Someone had asked me a few weeks ago about squaring up blocks, and I don't square up blocks. I do trim them if they need it, but for the most part, I leave them exactly how they're pieced. That doesn't mean I piece them perfectly every time. So let's put the 12.5 inch ruler on here and just see, and it's fairly close, but it is, kind of raggedy. And if I look on the corners, and if I look at some of these, I don't have a true 1/4 inch over here, and I don't have a true 1/4 inch here. Here I do, here I do. Some places I do, some I don't. So I could move this ruler around a little bit, but then what I correct on one end, I don't correct on the other end. So what I like to do is, unless some of these, there's a little bit to trim off here, and then a little bit to trim off here, but I'm going to leave it. I'm not going to trim it off because I don't want to change it too much. And I'm going to show you how to make this lay flat once you sew it to another block or you sew sashing onto it. So let me show you a little demonstration. Oops. Now let's say we have our sashings that go like this. We don't have the cornerstones right now, and let's say this is a little wonky. This edge is a little wonky, and maybe to get it to work on here, you need to move it a little bit. Let me show you a little demonstration on a smaller scale. Let's pretend like this is our quilt block, and this is our sashing. So let's put the sashing around like this. Now, if I were to square up or trim off this block, whatever I do for one side, it's going to affect all 3 other sides. So if I take this block and I'm going to put an exaggerated angle on it. So let's just put a weird angle like this. So now I don't have a square block. It's a little wonky, and you can tell. So it would go together like this. These sides, this side would be fine, it would match, and this side would match, but these 2 sides would not match. So if I were to try to match this, I would end up with something that looked like that. Or if we did this, it would be like this. Now you have this side matches, but all these 3 sides are wonky. So in order to do that, you have to look at each time you put a block to a sashing or a block to a block, whatever you do. Let's see, if I was going to take this, I would put this sashing here, and let's flip this over. So I'm going to line up this edge and line up this edge, and they line up pretty well. So I have to deal with this little part here because I know my sashing is straight. Let's put it on this line. I know my sashing is straight, and then it's going to be straight on this side, pretty straight. And what I'm going to do is just I'll draw a line. I'll draw a 1/4 inch seam line. So this is the seam line I'm going to make. You don't have to draw a seam line, but this is just showing you how I would piece this. So I'd start when I'm sewing, I'd start here and just keep sewing a 1/4 inch. When I got here, I would use this sashing as my guide. I know this is off, so I'm going to use that for my 1/4 inch. Now I've sewn this 1/4 inch and I used the sashing as my guide because I know it matches up here, but it got wonky down here. And when I open this up, then I have, and let's just finger press, then I have a nice straight line down here and a nice straight line there. When I tried to add my next sashing, it's going to be straight. So this one too, you would lay it down. When you match it, you make sure it lays flat. And another common problem is, let's say this is too short. Let's cut off some of this. Okay, now this is too short. So instead of lining up this edge and just going with whatever happens on this edge, then split the difference. So put it in half. You'll have a little bit extra there and a little bit extra there, but as long as that's okay, it will be taken up in the seam allowance that goes across this part, that goes across the top and the bottom. So what you do here is flip this over and then just match your edges and then kind of eyeball or just look and see how much you have. A little bit here and you've got more here, so maybe you want to move it over a little bit. Split the difference, so make it even. So now this is sewn, and when I open it and press it, then there's not much of a difference here. And I can take this piece and lay it, match it up like this, and you see how this, now this has a little bit extra here, and that will be taken up in the seam allowance. And then you just stitch your 1/4 inch all the way down, and everything else will match. But this is only a small amount, this difference here, and I can live with that because I know my seam is going to stay there once I do my 1/4 inch. Now let's see how we put this in real life. So here is my sashing strip, and here's my block I just finished. And the first thing I do is flip this over, and then I look at it and see how it lines up. And I can see down here, I've got a little bit extra. But in this case, I know my sashing is 12.5 inches because I didn't piece it, I just cut it. And if I put a ruler on it, it is 12.5 inches. So what I'm going to do here, instead of leaving this open like this, I'm going to ease it in. So I'll turn it over, and then I pin this side, make it even, because this was probably less than 1/8 of an inch. Then I'm going to pin this side over here, match the edges, and then the rest will be eased in. And that little bit along 12 inches is not going to show hardly at all. So I just line up the edges here for both the sashing and the block. And what I used to do before I started pressing my seams open, I would put the pieced part along the feed dogs, because if I put the sashing part along the feed dogs, this was cut on the lengthwise grain. That means there is no give there. It's not going to give at all. But if I had the pieced side along the feed dogs, those feed dogs would be pushing the fabric, and it would sort of help me ease it in. And also, since I started pressing open, I could see where my points are. So I want to be able to see where my points are and not cut them off as I'm stitching. So this little bit, you can ease it in, even though we have the lengthwise grain here. And when I say ease, I don't mean stretch. Don't stretch it like that, out of shape. You just kind of ease it on in as you go. And it is stretching it slightly, but you're not distorting it. If you're distorting it, then something's wrong. I'm going to start stitching here 1/4 inch. And when I get to these points, I'm going to stitch just on top of that point so it doesn't cut it off. And I'm going to try to regain my 1/4 inch and then aim for this next point, so I don't want to cut it off. And all the time you're making sure that these edges are even. And then you keep stitching 1/4 inch and you're aiming for this point. Also making sure that these edges are matching, then point to point. So what you're doing is stitching from the edge to this point, and from this point to this point, and this point to this point. That's all you care about from point to point, and then this point to the edge, and try to make the edge just even. So I'm going to sew this and show you what it looks like. Now here's my stitching. I started on this edge, and then I aimed for this point. So I try to miss that point, and then aim for this point. And here's where you can see a little bit of easing going on, but that's going to press out. And then go to this point, and then I ended up down here, but let me flip this over because this came out just a little bit off, so that's less than 1/8 inch. And once I had this pressed, so now I pressed it, and there's a little bit of a difference here you can see. But when I sew this next piece on, this next piece here, I can take it up. So I'll just lay it on here, and then let's turn this over. So you see that's just a little bit there. So you take each seam into consideration. And as I put this down here, and I'm going to do my next one, I'll lay it down first. Of course, this doesn't belong here, but it needs the cornerstones. But I lay it down first and look and see how it looks just laying flat, and see where your corrections need to happen. I hope I've made sense of my ramblings here. The point I wanted to get across is I don't trim off. Once I've done a block, I don't trim off, because if I need to trim off a whole bunch of stuff, then something's wrong. I've pieced it wrong, and that needs to be corrected. And most of the things I can accept if they're a little off, but I don't go through and trim every block. I just leave it how it is. I do look at each one with my ruler to see where I might have some problems. And sometimes I will go and redo something, but you can look at the back and see sometimes where it's not a true 1/4 inch, but it's enough fabric in there that the quilt won't rip out. It's plenty. So that's my point I wanted to make, and I hope I got it across to you, because sometimes I just ramble on, but that's what I do. I just split the difference and always pin. And when you're putting these sashings on, especially when you're doing the long sashings and cornerstones, pin as much as you can, and then just stitch from pin to pin, and then everything should work out. So this distance you have here, make sure that distance lays as flat as you can get it. Then next time concentrate on this distance. So you want to put as many pins as you can and use them. I never used to use pins, and when I started using pins, my piecing was better. Good luck with all of your blocks, and next week we'll be putting it together and showing you how to do the cornerstones and the sashing, and then cutting the border with the lengthwise grain if you want, and then we'll finish out the quilt top. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and while you're at it, click the bell to be notified of future videos.